dimensionality and multiplicity. Yes, I'm familiar, and I do use them. Um, I don't mention them directly, although I do have one article that came out recently about multiple star system theory that's based on concepts of multiplicity. I see the two as ways of categorizing research. So you have your conceptual frameworks that may be specific, that may be derived from things that you're doing, things that you're working on, original ideas. But then you can see, all right, in this research, am I dealing with things that relate to each other, such as African people in different places, African languages, African concepts? Or am I dealing with multiplicity in terms of multiple definitions, multiple iterations of the same thing, things of that nature? So in terms of either one, I think really with multiplicity, I have a few articles that deal with multiple definitions of concepts as they exist there. Also showing relations between African, which equals black people, and manifestations of the African equals black worldview, and also all of this to propose new perspectives. And why I think this is important, and I think that's actually one of the questions, but I want to say it from the outset. From the outset, is that right now we have a challenge, which is what I call galamsey research. Now, what is galamsey research? Galamsey research is where you bring an excavator from overseas, right? And you go off into the bush and you just dig up raw materials, whether it's gold or bauxite or whatever, intellectual materials. Without processing anything, you just hand it right back to them in international journals. You do no value addition. So the same problems that we have with our material as African people is the same problem we have with our intellectual material as African people. And what I'm talking about is the excavator, in this case, is a theory that comes from the West, so-called, or the North, or wherever we want to call white people. The theory that comes from white people, whether it's Marxism, communism, neoliberalism, neo-patrimonialism, all these isms, these are excavators that we import. We get our raw materials for them, then we send it back out, as opposed to doing value addition and developing theories that describe, that explain, that predict, that do things that are necessary for our society. You understand? So I think this is one of our problems. I think that, well, let me give you examples of work that I use this in. So multiplicity. Recently, I did an article called A Stylistic Analysis of Jimmy Sri Lanka's On Allah in the Path. Actually, we changed it at the last minute to intertextual analysis rather than stylistic. So this is even talking about both. It's not necessarily either or, because in one sense it's multiplicity, but then it's still showing the relations between these different phenomena. So an intertextual analysis of Jimmy Sri Lanka's On Allah in the Path and the multiple star system theory of mutual illumination and interaction, and that was in the Legon Journal of Humanities that came out this year. So basically, in various literary critiques and theories, they talk about, oh, there's mutual illumination between these two different phenomena or artworks or whatever. So it's like, oh, somebody did a poem, and based on that poem I want to do a drawing or a painting, and I name it after the poem. So the poem sheds light on the subject in the same way that the painting sheds light back onto the poem. So it helps you understand the poem better when you see the painting. It helps you understand the painting better when you hear the poem, something like that. Or I was inspired by this artist, this novelist, this whatever. So it's an analogy, it's an extended metaphor to say that they mutually illuminate each other. But sometimes something can become so metaphorical that we lose sight of the literal thing that we were talking about in the first place. So I said, let's think about things that literally mutually illuminate each other, such as this star and that star, because you have binary star systems. You have, star systems that have multiple stars, 3, 4, 5, so forth and so on. So in those star systems, you have this star is illuminating that star, literally. But that's not the only relationship that exists between these stars. So you have some cases where this star has so much gravity that it can pull matter from that star into it. You understand? So basically you can think about this as oh, I was so inspired by that rap that I decided to take a few lines from it, or I decided to comment on that line. It's just like this star that's pulled from that star. But even in terms of how stars are formed, that this is what we were talking about yesterday. Now you have all of this stardust, to use this term colloquially, all this stardust that they start to gravitate towards each other. All these billions and trillions of particles start to gravitate toward each other. So these become 2, these 2 become 4, these 4 become 8, they become 16. The 16 now pulling 32, the 32 now pulling 64. Then it happens on a scale of millions and billions that all of them start to congeal together. So this is what you have in what are called nebula. So these are the birthplaces of new stars. So as they start to come together, eventually they become so dense that the gravity collapses in on itself, and then it lights up nuclear fusion. It sets off a reaction of nuclear fusion, and that's when a star is born. So the fusion, the nuclear fusion, continues on at the scale of multiple atom bombs, all of that energy. And as it keeps coming together and pulls in other matter and other mass, then eventually that it can start to pull in additional stardust. So that's what happens at the formation of the solar system that we're in right now. But there wasn't enough stardust all put together to create multiple stars. It was only enough that all this stardust comes together, and then eventually it becomes Earth. This one becomes Jupiter, this one becomes Mars, so forth and so on. But in systems where there's more stardust, these nebula that have more stardust, that this one comes together and then it pulls in this other stardust, and there's so much of it that this one starts to collapse in on itself, and then guess what? It sets off nuclear fusion in that one. So now you have multiple stars, and they rotate around a common barycenter. That's what you call this place of balance. So one may be bigger, one may be smaller, but they're all rotating around this common barycenter, B-A-R-Y-C-E-N-T-E-R, barycenter. And you can think about that common barycenter as like a theme. So all of these different texts are revolving around a central theme. You understand? They can also interact in terms of, like I said, mass exchange. One can pull in mass from the other one. Where overflows is what they call Roche-Lobe overflow. So here you have this, invisible place where the gravity is not enough to hold on to the mass that the star has. So then it can start to, once it overflows, it can lose that mass to the other star that's in the same system. So basically, we're starting off with this concept of mutual illumination. We're taking it from just cliche to saying, no, what are things that actually mutually illuminate stars? But not only do they mutually illuminate, they have all these other, types of things that go on. You have tidal forces that go on, just like how you have tidal forces in the ocean, that on the surface of this star, it can be disturbed by when it comes into close proximity to a larger star, or the star with more mass and more gravity. So all of that is for a literary study. Because we start off with Conceptual, and that is the first star that is being born. And then based on that, you have The Road is Clear by Jimmy Sholanke. So that's based on the same theme of this. It's dealing with this path, it's dealing with the river, and literally they were looking at this first Akan drum text in order to create that one. And then Jimmy Sholanke comes up with a poem based on the one that he got in English that he's now translating into Yoruba. That you can look at this as the formation of multiple star systems. This was the first one to be created, but it pulled in this other one, which was Ralph McDonald, who said, wow, that's such a powerful, beautiful, profound thing. Let me write a poem. That's the second nuclear fusion that set off. And then both of those were there when Jimmy Sholanke was commissioned to write the beginning of this song called The Path. So you hear the first one is drum text and spoken, and the one in The Path sounds absolutely nothing like their context, but it still has the river. It still has, the path. It has who is the elder, which one is the elder, and all of these same elements. So we're dealing with multiple stars, that's multiplicity, but at the same time you're talking about what are the relations between these things. So again, it's not a question of either or, that in some cases you can categorize this research in terms of multiplicity. In another sense, you can categorize it in the sense of relationality, but it can be both and at the exact same time. So that's one. And then relationality. In another text that came out this year in Contemporary Journal of African Studies, I was dealing with Akan Anansi stories, Yoruba Ijapa tales, and the Dikenga theory. So Akan, this is primarily what in the place now known as Ghana. Yoruba is primarily in the place now known as Nigeria, and then Dikenga is in the place primarily now known as Congo, even though, you know, the Congo Kingdom went into Angola, into both Congo, DRC, and Brazza, and then, you know, into Gabon as well. But anyway, in a text called Self-Healing Power and Therapy that in Kikongo we call Lindomuku Kinyakisa, the author says that among the Bakongo they understand that nothing exists that doesn't follow this paradigm of conception, birth, height, death, conception, birth, height, death, so forth and so on. And everything keeps going, whether it's a star, whether it's a human being, whether it's a dog, whatever it is, all things are conceived. Whether it's an idea that comes to fruition, all things are conceived, they're born, they go to their height, and then they die, and then they go back to a place of conception to repeat that cycle again. So, because basically that's a hypothesis, and it's a ready-made theoretical framework that's ready for testing. All right, if everything follows it, well, do these stories follow it? All right, well, you have the conception of the story as an idea. You have the birth, which is, you can say, when it starts to be told, it goes to its climax, and then it, you know, sets. But the idea is that all human beings are living suns. So it's both heliocentric and anthropocentric at the same time. Because a human being a living sun, it means that what the sun is made of is the same thing that you're made of. The same way the sun goes through this process is the same way that you go through this process. And by extension, so does everything else. So now the story has its climax and then it sets. Well, now when the sun sets, from your perspective, does the sun stop existing? No, it continues existing. So now, and I just gave a presentation where this came up as well, where the question I was asked was, well, how does this concept of cyclical, whatever, how does it relate to linguistics or the study of language or whatever? I say, when we look at the study of language as linguists, usually we look at, this is the beginning of the sentence, this is the end of the sentence, and we look at it like a line, basically. But what we don't look at is what happens underneath that line. After the sentence has been uttered and is not being said anymore, well, what is the effect that it has on the person psychologically? What continues to live on even after the sentence is no longer being uttered? And this can actually be measured, and I actually want to work with somebody in psychology to deal with the cognitive effects of being told something. You can measure brain waves. Now you can't see, you know, visually what's going on inside that person after I said something, but you can measure it in other ways, and that's what's going on underneath, you know, this horizon before it's born again in a different way. So any conversation, I said it, it stopped for me, but now there's something going on inside of you that makes you respond. So now this is your response is now the birth of something in direct reaction to that, and vice versa. That's call and response. That's in songs. That's in everything we do. So again, we're looking at three different phenomena: Anansi stories, Ijapa tales, and Dikenga. And then we're seeing how they relate to each other. And this is one thing my father used to always tell me, is that whatever it is, you have to think about how it relates, how it's relative, and how it's relevant. You should be able to answer those three questions.
All right.
Relates. You look like you're hot.
How it relates.
How it's relative, and how it's relevant. The three R's, he would call it. And I don't know if he got that from somewhere else, but I got it from him, so let me cite him. And this was a thing, if you recall, Professor Gordon, who was Kwame Nkrumah chair, that at the end of almost everybody's presentation, unless they made it explicit, he would say, so what? So what? He said, you know, I'm going to ask my so what question, because he's asking, how does this relate to African studies? You went to your village, you tasted your grandma's soup, and you came to report that it's delicious. How does that relate to African people or anything else? And so again, this is coming back to this idea of relationality. You have to see how it's relative, how these different phenomena are relative to each other, then how they relate back to you as an African person, and how they relate to all African people. How is it relevant? Why do we care? You know what I'm saying? How does it help us explain something? How does it help us describe something? How does it help us define something? How does it help us to predict something? That whatever your conceptual or theoretical frameworks are, they should help to do any of those things, among other things that they could also possibly do. But at least they should be able to serve some type of baseline. They should also help you to organize, in the sense of having organizing principles. They should help you to evaluate, in the sense of evaluative criteria. By what means is this African? It's just because I see some African people doing it, they may be doing something that's very anti-African. And we can quantify it in various ways. We can use qualitative things. We can, show how it's relative in terms of a prototypical type of African thing versus how far away from this type of prototype is it, and whatever the thing is. So again, that's what that one is. So I put both of those at the top of multiplicity and relationality. I had another article that came out this year. Busy year.
Yeah, I was wondering, how many have you fired so far?
6 this year.
Wow.
And I'm going for 10, and I should get 10 by this year. I want 10 every year. And this one is non-African linguists be like, this is a new way to quote. So in all the linguistics literature, they said that quotative like is something that started by white people in the 1980s, which is where you introduce a quote by saying like. And then I was like, I'm going to the store. And then she was like, oh no, you ain't. Then I was like, oh yes, I am. So I'm introducing my quote of what I said by like. So what we do is we go back into the 1800s and document examples of black people formerly enslaved who were doing this exact same thing. Then we started singing like Sally was a good girl. Then we started doing like boom. Then we were like wham. So all these things, and as well before the 1980s, it's back into the 1880s. But of course, nobody has challenged, this view. White people have had 30 years to come up with anything before the 1980s, but all of them are unanimous that it started in 1980 with a song by Frank Zappa or whatever on California Girl or whatever the thing is. So we're challenging this to show that not only is this something that black people were doing in the U.S. prior to the time that all linguists have agreed upon, but this is something that you can find antecedents for in African languages like Chi. So if I use the word se, what is the word se? One is to be like or to resemble. And I say usame, so to be like, we have this like definition, but then that exact same like is used to introduce a quote. The kachira me se, meba, or kachira me se, baby, umma. So this exact same quotative like is the same thing that we use here. So we're showing the relations between how black people talk in the States and how black people talk here, and saying because as black people we invented language, that all of these things are things that we took over, with us. Now Eurasians just came up on it in the 1980s, but we were doing this way back into the 1880s. And if more people were doing research on black people, we would find examples into the 1700s, 1780s, 1680s, 1580s. But again, that's a paucity of resources, but we're showing these relations between African people on the continent and the diaspora, just as our mandate is in the African Genius speech. We're supposed to go beyond just the borders of continental Africa. So in some places, they may just say, this is how it works in Chi, and then we sit down. But now, how is that really African? It's more ethnic group studies, which is not to say it's bad, but it's not really, let's say, on the prototype of what our mandate is as African studies. It's to show these different connections. So that's more on the relationality. On the multiplicity side, intellectual warfare, theory, and practice. Gates, Thornton, White World Terror Domination, and the War on Afrocentricity. That was also this year. And basically, Afrocentricity, you had Henry Louis Gates who tried to hijack the term Afrocentricity, but he got an open door to do so by Molefi Asante, who says, oh, it's not just for black people, it's not just for African people, it just means you put Africa at the center. So Henry Louis Gates said, great, let's put Africa at the center and say African people are solely responsible for the enslavement of African people. You understand? That's what he and Thornton both do. That's what he did in Wonders of the African World. He just tried to do this in a new series that came up where this guy Ben Affleck had predecessors. I don't want to call them ancestors. Predecessors who had enslaved black people. He covered that up, and it was documented. There was this whole leak of all Sony Pictures emails, and he was literally doing the same thing. He did it in one of the African World, and every book that he's written, since then, on the subject where black people are entirely responsible. That's Afrocentric. You put black people you put African people at the center. How do you like that? But again, in that definition that Asante gave, he said just as long as you put Africa at the center, fine. So, dealing with these contested definitions of what Afrocentricity is, because Asante had a caveat, he said, in ways that benefit black people. Well, all Gates and Thornton did, Gates being the attack dog for the white guy Thornton, all it is just said, let's take out the part about things that benefit. Let's just put Africa at the center. That's Afrocentricity, and that's it. So, basically, I was looking at that whole process that Gates and Thornton are doing are the same. It's the same process that Christian missionaries use in order to sanitize elements that they thought were consistent with Christianity in indigenous cultures, and then demonize anything that they felt was inconsistent. So if you have a story of Conceptual in Mexico, they say, oh, well, that's really the apostle who was coming to spread the word, and his enemies were Satan and blah, blah, blah. So they would hijack their concepts as they saw fit in order to push forward their white world terror domination agenda. So that's what that one was about. Chiswahili or Kiswahili, that's relationality. We showed how you have the exact same proverb in Chi that you have in Kiswahili, the exact same proverb in Kiswahili that you have in Chi, and how you can actually measure. You can use a matrix to show how they're similar or how they're proximate to each other in areas of worldview, and in areas that have to do with does it have to do with environment? If you have a shared environment, then you would have shared proverbs about coconuts. Now in Antarctica or wherever, you're not going to have proverbs about coconuts, but just showing how these similarities, these scales of similarities, can show how close the people are to each other, and also show how close their concepts are to each other. And you can actually map that out so you can visually see that. So again, this is very much on the relationality, scale. And then also that was a theoretical framework to be able to analyze how close or how distant anything is between different cultures. And also coming to the conclusion that proximity in one area may make up for distance in another area. So even though Tanzania is very far away from Ghana, that because we're all African people, or because we all have the human condition that we all live and die and give birth and whatever, that's why our proverbs may be similar. Yeah. Yes. So that's that one. So that should be very clear. Theory of endogenous and exogenous motivation in L2 migration. Basically, in second language acquisition, that's what everybody calls it, that people forget that, again, that's just an analogy, it's a metaphor, it's only one way of looking at things, but there are whole departments called second language acquisition, all this study. But I'm saying, that analogy, it only talks about how to acquire something. It's dealing with language like it's a possession to be acquired. Why do we have to be locked inside of conceptual incarceration? Like that's the only way of looking at getting a new language, as though I'm acquiring a possession. So basically, I said another way of looking at it is you can look at it like migration, where I'm going closer to this language. I may have things that push me away from the place where I was and pull me towards the place where I want to go. I may have things that push me away from this new place, whether it's fear or people laugh at me when I try to speak it or whatever, and then it pulls me back there. And then basically showing that language learning or lack thereof can be thought of as an analogous process to migration. Is it going to be a temporary migration? Is it going to be permanent, semi-permanent? That all of those same things, the pushes and pulls, can apply similarly to this. So basically dealing with multiple ways of looking at it, multiple perspectives on how to look at, language learning. But again, there's a concept of relationality in that as well. So again, it's not a sharp dividing line between the two. Kiliji, this is Yoruba that's spoken in Ghana, indigenously by the folks at Tewusu's place. Now, nobody knew what this language was. They just know that when they get possessed, they just say something and no one understands.
The Okule cult.
Exactly. Okule. And when you look at something like that, most likely it's coming from the Yoruba greeting, Okule, which is greetings for the household. But there are other things that are definite, that they have one Orisha. This is a divinity called Oko Alija. This is Orisha, Oko in Yoruba. So basically the structure of it has switched to how most Ghanaian languages work. So if I have something, it's more like my dog instead of dog my. Now if you look at Yoruba land, it's set up like dog my. If you come to Benin, you have some who still say it like dog my, where the possession comes after. Some who say it like my dog. As you come to Ghana, it's all my dog. So they still have the words that are Yoruba, but they have it structured like how Ghanaian languages are structured. So again, we're showing the relations between how the Yoruba works in Yoruba mainland and how it works here, and how the sounds change. And really, once we see something like Orisha Oko and Oko Alija, that really lets us know they have Shankpana, which in Yoruba is Shokwana. All of the lexicon is the same, but it's just now structured like the languages that the people who are here, know. And then also looking at things like Ogun, Shokwana, and Okorisha, all of them have a very tight-knit relationship in the Yoruba pantheon, where one deals with leprosy, one deals with smallpox, and the other one is associated with the one who gave the leprosy one the tools in order to become a farmer. So all three of those travel together, and those are the three that they have together here with Okule. And we actually said let's not use the term cult because it has various negative connotations. So we decided to use spiritual system, spiritual group throughout. And I think that that's another thing in terms of contesting these things. We just receive things like people say chief, chieftaincy. That's the same thing as saying jungle. That's the same thing as saying hut. The idea is that theirs are kings and emperors and ours are chiefs. And it's just a way of saying that yours are not up to ours. That makes no sense in Chi, because Asante Hene, what do you call him? My own is Chidom Hene. We use the exact same word, Hene. So that means that there's no distinction in our own indigenous languages for those things to say one is a king and the other one is a chief. No, whatever it is, it has to be across the board. So if you're going to base it on our worldview, either you call everybody an emperor, you call everybody a king, or you call everybody whatever. But then the question becomes, how come ours are chiefs, but then theirs is the Queen of England, or theirs is the King of Spain, or the King of Monaco, or whatever the thing is. So again, we have to contest some of these definitions, because built into how we learn this English language are things that denigrate us and put us on a lower scale. But we just accept it because we don't really understand English that well. We don't understand all these nuances. It's just, I'm just going to say what's necessary to get a job or whatever. That's that. So Africanisms in contemporary English, that's relationality, showing the relations between how we still have lots of the words, lots of the structures, so forth and so on, in U.S. English that are found in African languages. So when people look at how black people talk there, they say, oh, you're speaking bad English. No, you're speaking correct African. And as a people who invented language itself, we have a right to speak correctly. Akan noun, verb, nominal compounds. We're dealing with a different perspective on how these compounds are made in the language. Legacies and impact of transatlantic enslavement on the diaspora. We're looking at contesting the term. That's multiplicity again. Some people see legacy as something that's positive. Oh, I want to leave a legacy. You don't mean I want to leave garbage. You're saying I want, the connotation is built in. It's something positive. But how can we talk about legacy of enslavement when, one, enslavement has never ended, according to the 13th Amendment, that slavery nor involuntary servitude shall exist in the United States except as punishment for a crime, whereas the party has been duly convicted. This means all we have to do is say you committed a crime and we can enslave you, which is why you have more black people in prison working for free than you had in enslavement in 1865, the so-called end of enslavement. and that's very much intended. That's why they put the caveat in there, so they can legally re-enslave black people. And they started immediately after the end of so-called enslavement through convict leasing. They would say, you spat on the ground, you're under arrest, you have to go dig 5 tons of coal per day. Oh, you stole a fence. No, I didn't, sir. Yes, you did, and you can't testify in court against me. So now we will work you to death on the plantation. So some of the guards who were being interviewed at that time, they said this is much better than slavery, because during slavery you have to pay for their clothes, you have to feed them even in the off season when they're not working. This one, you just arrest one, work them to death, and then you go arrest another one. And mostly it was children, who got caught up into the system, so forth and so on. You're walking on railroad tracks. They actually just invented laws just to have any reason to enslave black people. So when it's time to harvest cotton, now there's a crime wave. All black people have committed crimes. And now, even when you come here to the continent, people have the view that, oh, everybody there is a criminal, without understanding that, no, that is the reason they just arrest all black people to keep them working. So Dell uses convict labor, in this privatized presence, Boeing, Compaq, HP, all these things that we get is slave labor. It's enslaved Africans working for free in these privatized prisons. And I was this close to being one of those who was working for free, and I would just be getting out this year if I didn't have a lawyer and $10,000 to waste because a white man happened to want to lie. But that's neither here nor there. So that's multiplicity, multiple definitions. How can you talk about post anything or legacy of anything that's still ongoing? You understand? I can't say my afterlife and I'm still here. What are you talking about? Yeah. And then singing truth to power and the disempowered, basically the idea that power is a dialogue. So we're dealing with Lucky Mensah. In his song, he's talking back to the president. Uncle Terry Ajay Kratue. So I use these concepts. I also develop conceptual and theoretical frameworks based on African, which equals black epistemology, as articulated in the works in the table above. Why are these concepts important in your work? It is necessary that we move beyond galamsey, which is what I mentioned before, research, where we take intellectual excavators from Eurasians to mine African epistemological resources only to send abroad in their raw form. Indigenous African equals black conceptual and theoretical frameworks have descriptive, explanatory, and predictive power that can serve as value addition to our knowledge creation and ideational work. And that's what we need to be doing. You have to stop. And this is even to get a promotion to say you have to submit to an international journal. They're basically saying the same thing we do with our research. You just have to, sell the gold in its raw form, the cocoa in its raw form, whatever in its raw form. That benefits them, and it doesn't benefit us here, nor is it supposed to. That's why they give you grants. That's why they give you whatever, to make sure you keep doing galamsey research. So that makes sense. So in African studies, and generally speaking, I think there needs to be, that should be needs instead of needs. There needs to be a greater focus on developing our own frameworks and knowledge creation to articulate relationships between African people, ideas, and concepts as a relationality. They can also serve as organizing principles that can be coupled with evaluative criteria to organize lines of research inquiry and to structure our thinking along lines consistent with manifestations of the African, which equals black worldview. So is your research in alignment with the African worldview, or is it out of alignment with the African worldview? You can't know that until you have some type of framework to even understand what is the African worldview. You have people who are like, there's no such thing, we're so diverse, and blah, blah, blah. Now, white people say that they have their reasons for saying we're diverse because they want to do the divide and conquer. If we're saying we're diverse, we're saying it for a different reason. If they say we're all one thing and we're monolithic, they're doing it for a specific reason. If we're showing the commonalities amongst us, we're doing it for a certain reason. But even though on the surface it may look similar, the objectives and the ideas that are behind it are completely different. You understand? And then further, it may serve to stimulate research, advance theory, and also policy and praxis, and make an impact in the society. Yeah?
Yeah.
Hope that's clear.
Yeah, it's good. How about?
Yeah.
Okay, look. Many thanks.
I just did this on the fly because I had to prepare for my presentation today.
Yeah.
There was like one day.
Yeah.
There was like one day.
Yeah.
There was like one day. Yeah, so we're talking about relationality and multiplicity as means of categorization, right? And to organize our research in these ways, that's just one way of categorizing things. I just gave the example of these researchers who went to the Kwele people of Liberia when they asked them to categorize things in this way. So they had a hoe, they had a knife, they had a machete, they had all these, tools. They had, orange, they had plantain, they had yam, they had potato, they had all these different things. They said, okay, categorize these things. And every time they would put the orange together with the knife, they would put the machete together with the coconut, they would put the hoe together with the yam, all these types of functional combinations, you could say. And the researchers, they got exasperated, like, what's wrong with you? They said, why are you categorizing things like this? They said, this is how a wise person would do it. They said, okay, well, how would a dumb person do it? Then they got all the groups that they expected. They put all the knife and the machete and the hoe together. They put the orange and the coconut, together. They put the yam and the potato together. And basically the idea was, if you are wise, that means you have experience, knowledge and experience, then you know what it takes to get at the orange. Now a child who's 3 years old, they just know my mommy gives it, I put it in my mouth. My mommy gives it, they don't know where it comes from, they don't know the work it takes to get to it. So you have the exact same people who can categorize things like dumb people categorize it, or they can categorize things the way smart people and wise people categorize it. And I was saying that we can look at multiplicity as way and relationality as ways to categorize the research that we're doing. But even that in and of itself is what I would say is conceptual incarceration that we need to be moving away from. Who says that that is the way, the best way, or even a way that we should entertain of how to categorize our research in the first place? Now, we were given this as a suggestion that, I can look at my work. Some things I could put in the multiplicity column, some things I could put in the relational column, but I'm basically doing what the researchers are saying, how would a dumb person categorize things? That as an African person, I should be thinking about what types of epistemologies, cosmologies originate with African people in which things benefit African people. Not does it fit into Deleuze's paradigm, does it fit into whoever's paradigm here, whatever. So, we're talking about us developing our own theories. Part of that is developing our own concepts and ways of categorizing things. You understand? So I think that that's really what we need to be doing. So I don't know if those were just given as suggestions of you can look at your work in this way and that way.
And then I think there was also some questions about what concepts you prefer.
Yeah, so I dealt with that one as well.
Yeah.
But even to start off with multiplicity and relationality, it privileges those as though those are the ones that we should deal with, the types of frameworks that we need to deal with, or means of categorizing that we need to deal with. Why can't we say, well, what's the Congo Dikenga way of categorizing? Let's look at noun class systems. So among the Waswahili, they have a way of categorizing every single noun that exists. You understand? So things that are abstract concepts go into this one, in Kikongo too. So Lu is for abstract concepts. If the word starts with Lu, it's something abstract and intangible. If it starts with Ki, it's the art of, such as the art of speaking this language, the art of doing that language. If you have Ba, you're talking about multiple human beings. So you have singular and plural of all these different ways. So why can't we categorize things along that way? If you look at ancient Kemet, they had these determinatives, where at the end you would have a picture that shows you what group this thing goes into. So if it has something to do with resting, you'll see a determinative of a man sitting. If it has something to do with a plant, then you'll have a determinative that actually shows a plant growing. So again, these are indigenous African ways of categorizing things that we don't have to box it into. Is it multiplicity? Is it relationality? Because even to suggest those, it privileges, Eurasian formulations of we should categorize things along those lines.
Okay.
Yeah.